On the 10th of May in 1941, Rudolf Hess took off to Britain in a specially prepared Messerschmitt Bf 110. While flying over Britain, he got lost and failed to find his destination, the Dungavel House. At 23:06, his plane was running out of fuel, and he was forced to parachute in an area south of Glasgow. He was consequently arrested by the Home Guard and later handed to the army. Hitler's right-hand man and one of the most important people to the Third Reich began his life as a prisoner of Winston Churchill. Hess had informed his captors that he was going to land on the private airstrip at the Dungavel House, which belonged to Duke Hamilton, who was the king's representative north of the border. This was done while remaining sympathetic towards the idea of signing a peace treaty with Germany. Duke Hamilton obviously denied any knowledge of Hess's mission, and Hitler very quickly announced that Hess had stolen the aircraft without his knowledge. That explanation was happily accepted by Great Britain and became the official, unchallenged version for the following 60 years. There are certain factors that suggest this doesn't have to be true. First of all, until his trial at Nuremberg, Hess became a British prisoner and all access to him was strictly controlled by Churchill himself. While talking with the British in 1941, Rudolf Hess very accurately predicted two major consequences for Great Britain in case they decided against signing a peace treaty with Germany. These were losing the empire and economical supremacy to the United States, and also lose the domination of continental Europe to the Soviet Union. Certain authors suggest that Hitler knew of Hess's mission, but in case of failure, he would have denied any knowledge. If we take into account that at the same time there was a quite strong peace-orientated group among British who were losing the war, it seems to be quite a reasonable theory. Among the supporters of the peace process were George VI and his mother, Queen Mary. Hess's flight was a proof of the sincerity of the German offer, and the British knew he was arriving. They were waiting for him at the Duke of Hamilton's residence. Even the MI6 director, Sir Stuart Menzies, was in favor of signing the peace treaty as he believed the war was benefiting the real enemy, the Soviet Union. Although some researchers believe that the British Special Intelligence Service, SIS, was involved in luring Hess into Britain in what was a deception operation, it could have been totally opposite, aiming to oust Churchill and replace him with someone willing to start peace negotiations with Germany. There were many politicians opposing the war and Churchill's politics as well. Rudolf Hess brought with him a detailed proposal, as witnessed by many people. All of it was rejected by Churchill. Not only was it not shown to the British people, but even the War Cabinet did not get a chance to view it. The documents officially never existed, so we do not know the German terms, but Hess himself claimed that if Europe was left to Germany, they would leave the British to their empire. This was even acknowledged in the draft of one of Churchill's speeches. Germany's point was that Britain was in a no-win situation. Even if the British emerged victorious after the war, they would be financially ruined. That, in consequence, would mean the end of the British Empire. During his captivity, Hess was visited at least twice by representatives of the British government, including Lord Simon, the Lord Chancellor, and Lord Beaverbrook, a powerful Canadian financier. Hess wrote a report and gave it to Lord Beaverbrook. In that report, he claimed the victory of Great Britain would mean the victory of Bolshevism, as the Soviet Union would spread its political and ideological influence all over continental Europe. Hess also claimed that the longer the war lasts, the more the balance of power between the UK and the US would move towards America. He has openly said that signing a peace treaty with Germany would make the US furious, as they were looking forward to inheriting the British Empire. History has shown that Hess's predictions were right. The Soviet Union has dominated half of Europe for almost 50 years. Great Britain has lost its empire and become dependent on the United States, a fact many British still do not want to see. At the time of Hess's flight, Britain was in a very difficult situation. Despite its promises to help Poland, the Allies did not want to help the Poles in their fight. The occasional naval fights and strategic bombing were overshadowed by a humiliating loss in Norway. When Hitler had launched his blitzkrieg on France and lower countries, the Allies were humiliated once again, with the British hastily evacuating their troops from Dunkirk. After signing the armistice with France, Hitler was hoping the ultimatum to Great Britain would be accepted by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who who infamously signed the Munich Treaty in September 1938. Chamberlain was replaced by the uncompromising Winston Churchill. Hitler's last offer of a peace treaty was rejected, although Churchill had to face opposition even from the members of his war cabinet. Britain was protected against German divisions by the English Channel and the North Sea. Germans indeed drew up plans for Operation Sea Lion, an invasion on Great Britain, but there were some people arguing they were drawn to divert attention from preparations of an attack on the Soviet Union. Even if Hitler initially was planning to invade Britain, that was completely unnecessary. Europe, from Scandinavia to Spain, was under Nazi control. There was no need to invade Britain, as a sea blockade by the U-boats would be sufficient enough. There was a deep pessimism in Britain as their country's position was very bad. When the Battle of Britain had started, the Luftwaffe was bombing airfields, ports, and factories, but in September, they switched to the act of terror bombing major cities, including London. No one thought they would ultimately fail. British forces were no match for the Wehrmacht, as even Sir Alexander Cadogan wrote about the British evacuation in Greece. Our soldiers are the most pathetic amateurs, pitted against professionals, tired, depressed, and defeatist. Also, Great Britain was totally dependent on the US for munitions and food. The situation had completely changed after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet Union suddenly became an ally, and after Pearl Harbor, the US officially, and very willingly, joined the war. These were the turning points. From then on, Britain could not lose a war. Churchill played a very active role in the development of the situation, mainly by exploiting Hess's failed mission. First of all, Churchill had to neutralize the peace group opposition in Britain. As his first year in office was not very successful, he often had to face opposition. His position was strengthened by the death of Neville Chamberlain in 1940, but the opposition within his own government lasted until 1941. On July 20th of that year, Churchill carried out an operation called the Churchillian Night of the Long Knives, and after that turning point he would face no serious political opposition. Churchill had managed to neutralize political threats thanks to Wartime Law Regulation 18B that allowed detention of anyone being considered by government to be a threat to the war effort. After Churchill came into power, 150 people were imprisoned under that regulation, including the leader of the British fascist regime, Sir Oswald Mosley. Only a few from Churchill's position were sympathetic towards Hitler. The majority believed that it would be in the best interest of Great Britain and its empire to sign a peace treaty. For them, the biggest were the Soviets. Many were advocating steering both Germany and Russia into conflict. Amongst the supporters of this idea were Neville Chamberlain, Sir Stuart Menzies, and Prince George, Duke of Kent, who mysteriously died in August of 1942. The signing of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Act in August of 1939 caused great confusion among Western countries. Once this was signed, Great Britain and France had to realize that war was inevitable. There was also a secret protocol dividing Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union. There is some evidence that the Allies knew of it before the Soviet Union joined the anti-German coalition, but it is not absolutely conclusive. Also, it's worth mentioning that in Nuremberg, Russian judges condemned the Nazi leader for conspiracy to wage war, but there was no mentioning of their own government and the Soviet aggression on Poland. There is evidence that Hitler wanted to sign an alliance with Poland, but when the Polish government changed its course and started drifting towards the Western countries, the alliance with the Soviet Union was the only option for Hitler, allowing him to fight only on one front. France and Great Britain sacrificed Poland for their own safety. If Poland would have joined Germany, the attack on France and Low Countries could have been launched much earlier with Polish divisions, securing Germany and protecting them from the Soviets, or even helping in their attack. As a consequence, Britain probably would have never fell as quick as France did after securing victories on the Western Front. Hitler could have invaded Russia, fighting on just one front and having the Polish divisions to help. Obviously, Operation Barbarossa would have been launched much quicker, and Hitler probably would have crushed the Soviet Union. There is a connection between Rudolf Hess's flight and the launch of Operation Barbarossa a few weeks later. If Hess's peace mission would have succeeded, Hitler would have had to fight only on one front. After Hess was captured, he had to deny any knowledge of his flight, otherwise Stalin would immediately realize that the Soviet Union was the next target. Churchill knew that the Nazis planned to attack the Soviet Union. He was a good strategist, and by pretending he was involved in negotiations with Hess, he was pushing Hitler towards the Soviet Union. Even Goebbels noted that the Fuhrer had high hopes of signing a peace treaty with Great Britain. Although no formal agreement was made, and there was not even communication that took place, the silence of the British side was deafening. Churchill's game could have even led to virtual armistice, as Hess's flight coincided with the last night of the Blitz, and the terror bombing of the British cities ended a few days later. Churchill could exploit the flight on one more front, America. By pretending that the peace deal with Germany was possible, he could have put pressure on the US. As for America, the end of the war would have probably been the worst possible scenario. Just 2 months before Hess's flight, the US and Great Britain had agreed to the Lend-Lease Act. By signing it, the US had completely removed the facade of neutrality and agreed to supply Britain. Thanks to that, Britain was able to remain one of the key players in the game. But it also meant that the British debt to America was increasingly dramatic, and it was likely that Great Britain would never be able to repay it. The British consul from New York was reporting that the silence after Hess's capture was causing uncertainty and believes that Britain was taking steps towards signing a peace treaty with Nazi Germany. United States President Roosevelt was very suspicious of Hess's mission. Later, when he asked Churchill for details on Hess's mission, the British Prime Minister responded that Hess was offered the choice of several years of war or peace, effective immediately. When Roosevelt made his speech on the 27th of May, he declared an unlimited national emergency. He stated that the Nazis' next target would be America, so it made perfect sense for them to support Britain. He was also aware that many companies and investors would go bankrupt if the war they were supplying were to stop. Orders from Great Britain were preventing the U.S. economy from sliding into depression, or a crisis that could be equal to, or even worse than, the Great Depression. Churchill very skillfully diverted Nazi armies toward the Soviet Union, at the same time assuring Stalin that Hess's arrival did not mean the start of peace negotiations. He also led Roosevelt to believe that peace with the Nazis was still possible. The Red Army started to fight the war for Britain, but there were also different consequences Churchill never thought about. The war in Europe boosted the American economy, and in the long term, it allowed the U.S. to overtake the British Empire's economical supremacy. That effectively meant that America became the world's biggest financial power. Great Britain eventually lost its power, empire, and was forced into dependency on the U.S. They have won the war, but lost everything else with the Soviet Union, effectively dominating half of Europe for the next 45 years.